Now, traffic inequality. Stroll through some of the neighborhoods here in the Twin Cities, and you'll often be able to discern the income levels of the people living there. Minneapolis-St. Paul, like many other metro areas, has fewer neighborhoods with a middle-income mix. But this might surprise you. The Twin Cities is one of the least income-segregated metros in the country. San Antonio, Memphis, San Francisco are among the most. Indeed, income segregation is much more common in cities than it was, say, 35 or 40 years ago. Why? As our guest Richard Florida joins us, I'd like your insight on this, too. What do you think the implications of a more income-segregated America are? What will it mean if more of the 1% cluster together in certain areas and poorer families cluster in others? Are there solutions to this? Here's the phone number, 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828. We're online on the Daily Circuit page, and I'm on Twitter at Carrie MPR. Richard Florida is director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto. He's a senior editor of The Atlantic, and he's with us today from Toronto. Richard, welcome. It's good you're on the show today. Welcome back.
It's great to be back, Carrie. Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you, is it right to say that there has always been a certain amount of income segregation in American cities? I mean, we can look back in history and see that this was occurring 75, 80, 100 years ago, couldn't we?
I think even the Greeks, when they wrote about this long ago, said cities were collections of the very rich and the very poor. And I think, cities have always attracted the very wealthy, not only who wanted to live in cities, but cities are great incubators of new ideas and new enterprise. And they've also attracted the very poor looking for work. All throughout world history, people have moved from the farms. African Americans moving from the rural South to the North after World War II. My grandparents moving from southern Italy, a farm in southern Italy, all four of them, from farms in southern Italy to Newark, New Jersey to seek opportunity. People today, all across the world, we know that 50% of the world's population is now urban. It was probably 10% 100 years ago. People leaving farms all throughout Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia to come to these centers of urban opportunity. So I think it's fair to say our cities have always had some level of inequality and some level of segregation. But as your opening pointed out, it has gotten a great deal worse. If our cities were somewhat balanced, or our metro areas were somewhat balanced in the time after World War II, especially in the 50s and 60s, certainly over the past few decades, income inequality and income segregation has gotten a great deal worse in our great cities and metro areas.
I was looking at some Pew data, and I think you have too, that, as you note, that shows that income segregation has risen in almost all of the largest American cities. So we're seeing this trend in most of our largest cities. What I'm interested in is, tell me how you measured this newest scale of income segregation, because are you using different measures today?
Well, it's very interesting. I've been pursuing research on this for the past year, and we'll have a massive report, and maybe you'll have us back on in the fall when we release the overall report on economic segregation. We look at income segregation, segregation of the poor and of the wealthy, educational segregation, segregation of the people who don't have a high school degree and people with a college degree more, segregation of people who do knowledge workers versus those who do low-skill service work. For this measure of income segregation, we use almost exactly the same measure that Pew study used. We really look at the kind of geographic gap separating those who are more affluent, those that in the Pew study define that as those that had 100,000 or more. I think they actually used 104,000. We used 100,000. And then the lower income households, those that make 34,000 or less. And we did that just for the wonky folks, the statistics folks listening in. We did that at the census tract level. So this is at the level of kind of a very small neighborhood. In the United States, there are 70,000 plus of these census tracts across our country. So we really look at the separation between those higher income household neighborhoods with 100,000 or more from the lower income household neighborhoods of 34,000 or less. And we do that for every metro and, in fact, every census tract in the United States.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what you find when your report comes out in the fall, and we'll definitely talk about it then. Let me grab a call here from Rachel in Dundee. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Of course. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I live in Dundee, Minnesota. I'd be surprised if you've heard of it because we have less than 100 people in this town. And one of the benefits of living in a town so small is I am, cheek to jowl with people of very different incomes than me, both higher and lower. And I know this study or this talk is about the metro areas, but I think that's one of the benefits of living in a small town is you're still neighbors and very mixed with people of all different sorts of incomes.
Rachel, I'm interested in, do you drive to a larger town to work, or is most of your professional and your social life in Dundee?
Great question, because yes and no. I'm a pastor at 5 small-town and rural churches.
Wow.
So one of them is in Dundee, and the other 4 are in different areas.
I'm so glad you called, because you really have a sense of this beyond just the town that you're living in. And Richard, as Rachel points out, is there kind of an opposite trend in rural America as we're seeing in the metros?
Yes, indeed. Well, 2 things. One, as you pointed out in your opening, Carrie, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities, have the very good distinction of being among the least segregated metros in the country. Only Rochester, actually not Rochester, only about 8 or 9 metros are less segregated. Orlando, Florida, Portland, Oregon, Virginia Beach, Seattle, Las Vegas, Sacramento, Salt Lake City. But that counted only large metros. When we look at all metros, and this is in the right-hand column of my report, Minneapolis-St. Paul ranks 173rd out of all 350 metros. When we look at the large metros, we're only looking at those metropolitan areas with populations of greater than 1 million. Mm-hmm. The lowest levels of income segregation by far in the United States are in small metros. Now, they're not as small as places like Dundee, but they're places with less than 250,000 people. Those are places like Grand Haven, Michigan, St. George, Utah, Glen Falls, New York, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin. So what is happening is in large metros, particularly because they're big, particularly because they have a range of living options, as the caller just said. They have wealthy suburbs and poorer suburbs. They have gentrifying urban neighborhoods and low-income, disadvantaged areas of concentrated disadvantage. They do have higher levels of segregation, and we find in our analysis a very significant correlation between the size of a metropolitan area and the population density. In other words, how many people live in that metro per square mile. And this is a big factor in segregation. The bigger our metros get, on average, Minneapolis, far less so than Memphis, but the bigger our metros get and the denser they get, on average, they tend to be more segregated, and vice versa. Smaller, more rural areas tend to be less segregated, with people living together in a way that we consider to be somewhat less segregated and perhaps better.
Richard, I was trying to figure out why this would be the case in the Twin Cities, because we have other disparities. We have the achievement gap here that a lot of leaders and citizens worry a lot about. I wondered if it has something to do with some of the regulations around housing. The cities, I should say, Minneapolis and St. Paul, have been, forward-leaning on regulations in housing to try to create more of these mixed neighborhoods. Is this a sign that it's working, or is this really just more organic?
I think there's a longer historical explanation. Way back when I wrote Rise of the Creative Class, and the follow-up book to that in 2004, 2005, but this was a decade ago, we began to look at inequality, not segregation, but wage inequality. And I had a student at that time from the Twin Cities area, and she did a report. And in that report, it became clear to us, my whole research team, that of any large metro in the entire country, while San Francisco or, Boston or Washington, D.C., with high levels of knowledge work, we're also seeing high levels of inequality. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area stood out as a place that had developed a robust knowledge economy, in my terminology, a large creative class of professionals and scientists and artists. But in contrast, and I think quite to your point, a quite a low level of inequality. It was what we call in academia an outlier, a knowledge economy with a astoundingly low. Now we don't like the level of inequality and segregation in the Twin Cities. We'd like it to do better. But compared to all the other metros, it had a much lower level of inequality. And
wow.
we believe that was due to a longer legacy of, and I'm saying this in air quotes with a small p, progressive politics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Twin Cities have always been open-minded. Some might say they had a Scandinavian democratic socialistic influence, that it's been a place that's been an outlier in American political life. Perhaps parts of Wisconsin are also like this, but it's been a Madison, Wisconsin, I'm thinking of, perhaps Milwaukee way back when. It's been an outlier in that it's been a fairer place. It's been a place that has taken better care of the poor. So I think that is probably where those housing regulations come from. And it seems to be, you know, I live in Toronto, a place that's more like Toronto in its social outlook. And its socioeconomic outlook, then it might be like San Francisco or Chicago or Boston. So I think it's a credit to this long history of progressivism, and I'm saying that again with a small p, and a sense that the Twin Cities could be a developed, competitive economy, but while making sure that the bottom does relatively well. And I think it's a place, you know, in that sense, the nation can learn from.
If you have just tuned in, you're listening to the conversation, wondering what we're talking about. Richard Florida is back with us. Always interesting when he mixes the data as he does with some intriguing analysis. He's director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, senior editor of The Atlantic. To be candid with you, I was preparing for another show. I ran across something that Richard Florida had written a few months ago about geographic inequality, and I noted that the Twin Cities kind of stands out in this. We are among the least income segregated metros in the country. Curious about why, what's going on in other cities like Milwaukee, where there is a lot of segregation of the poor. I'm going to talk to Richard about that in just a moment. And so as you listen to the way this conversation is deepening here, what do you think the implications of a more income-segregated America are? What happens when the 1% cluster in one part of the metro area and everybody else, or people on the lower end of the income scale, are clustered in other parts of the city? Now, again, Minneapolis-St. Paul bucking that trend. Do you think there are solutions to this, implications of it? Here's the phone number, 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828. I'm on Twitter, @Kerry, Kerri, MPR. You can go to the Daily Circuit page to get in on the conversation. Richard, I want to bring up Milwaukee here because Milwaukee ranks number one on your list of large metros where the poor are most segregated. So what's usually happening in a city where you're seeing this level of poor Americans clustering together?
You know, it's interesting. We look at both the segregation of the wealthy and the segregation of the poor, and I want to make a prefatory point. In the United States, the group that is becoming most segregated, and this is not only my own work, you quoted the Pew study, researchers named Reardon and Bischoff have looked at this. The wealthy are the group that 1% are the group that are really segregating themselves off. But I think when I look at that list of the places where the poor are most segregated, what that really reflects are hard-hit, more deindustrialized economies like Milwaukee, like Memphis, that have not developed the kind of knowledge economy that the Twin Cities or even San Francisco, which has high level of inequality, but where the poor are not quite as bad off as in other places. They have more on-ramps of opportunity. So I think it reflects that there's just larger concentrations of poverty, and perhaps what we're finding in other work and other scholars is in these deindustrialized metropolitan areas, you know, you get what urbanists call the classic, listeners, hole in the donut. The affluent people, the businesses, in many cases, white people, abandon the core of the city, leaving that center, that urban core, and perhaps Detroit is a good example of this, or a bad example of however you want to think of it, leaving that inner center being an area of concentrated disadvantage. So I think that's what we're finding, is that in many of the places where the poor are most segregated, tragically, those are those older Rust Belt cities that just have a larger concentration of poverty and haven't generated the kinds of, if I look at the list, Milwaukee, Hartford, Connecticut, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, which has a lot of affluence in the city but a lot of poverty, Buffalo, Denver, surprisingly, given that list, Baltimore and Memphis. But I think it does show that trend of the older Rust Belt manufacturing, deindustrialized metros, just having that bigger group of poor concentrated in the urban center with less availability of on-ramps of opportunity into those higher-paying knowledge jobs.
Just to note here before we take some more calls, when I looked at your map, you get a different perspective on this. You see clusters of cities with income segregation in the upper Northeast. You see them in Texas, and then you see them in Southern California. Now, given what you've just said, what connects those different areas of the country through this? Well,
first of all, and surprise to many people who consider Texas a boom state, and it is. It has oil, it has energy, it has knowledge jobs, and it has, had one of probably the best track record of job growth in America since the Great Recession. But when we look at the most income segregated metros in the country, San Antonio is first, Houston is fourth, Dallas is eighth, and Austin, probably one of our premier knowledge economies, is 10th.
Wow.
And I think that what that reflects in Texas is the dichotomy. I mean, in that way, Texas is a microcosm for the country. This dichotomized, split economy where there is, in Texas, lots of new good jobs in energy if you have a degree in, geological sciences, if you're an oil industry consultant, lots of good jobs in IT consulting, lots of good jobs in high tech in Austin. And then a missing middle, as the manufacturing jobs have gone offshore, and then a large number of either unemployed, part-time employed, self-employed, or low-wage service workers. And I think it's interesting. It's kind of the bi-coastal economy, northeast, vibrant hubs of knowledge and ideas, New York, greatest powerful city in the world, the California Bay Area and LA and Texas. And, in many ways, and my own research has pointed to this, the new American economy is no longer a manufacturing economy. It's a knowledge and energy economy, and that these new economic activities, these new economic sectors of knowledge, of technology and energy, because we lack a middle class, because we lack manufacturing jobs, are really the most divided places in America. So it's kind of alongside the good news of America's revival comes the bad news of America's divide.
To the phones to Brett in Minneapolis. Hi, Brett. Thanks for waiting. What do you want to say here?
Thanks for having me on.
Sure.
I wanted to explore a little bit how race enters into this geographical segregation business, because my understanding is that Minneapolis and St. Paul have one of the highest rates of racial segregation in the country, and yet income segregation is lower. And I'm wondering if it's because we have perhaps a lower percentage of minorities within the metro area than many other cities, and therefore race enters in a somewhat different way than in other places.
What do you think, Richard?
First of all, it's a super question. Just to clarify my own work, we did not look at racial segregation only because there is a huge number of studies of racial segregation, and it's well documented. But we do look at the correlations or statistical associations between race and economic and income segregation. And we find, on balance, a modest correlation. It's a significant correlation, but it's not an extraordinarily high correlation. It is correlated at the 0.3 level with the percentage of blacks and the 0.25 level with the percentage of Latinos. And it is also negatively correlated. So it's negatively correlated with the percentage of whites. So the larger the percentage of whites you get, the less segregation. So the point is that on balance, economic and income segregation is associated with the percentage of blacks and Latinos and negatively associated with the percentage of whites. So I think the caller's explanation, my research would suggest it's correct. If you have a lower percentage of these minority groups and a larger percentage of white or other immigrants, you would tend to have less economic segregation. That said, we know that race and poverty, that race and economic inequality, that race and economic segregation go together. So when you find areas of concentrated African American populations, generally speaking, you find areas of concentrated poverty. And my colleague Pat Sharkey at NYU, who's the leading researcher on this, a sociologist, notes that one of the most terrifying things in American urban life is that black neighborhoods tend to be areas of concentrated and persistent poverty, and that they're almost immune to upgrading and gentrification. So I think this is something that my work has been saying for a long time. While many urbanists are talking about gentrification and upgrading and looking at the yuppies, the bigger problem we face, not that that isn't a problem, is that many of our neighborhoods have been stagnant and poor, and particularly in the urban center, these minority neighborhoods. So the point is race and segregation, economic segregation, go together, and it's likely that places that have lower concentrations of blacks and Latinos will still have racial segregation, but economic segregation on balance will be lower.
You know, and yet, Richard, when I hear you talk about this, I think this is something that, again, community leaders, political leaders in our region spend some time worrying about, which is the diversity of our communities, and to make sure that as the cities become more diverse, and it's happening more slowly here than it's happening in other cities, that this economic flourishing that you're talking about in this area is bringing everyone along. That's a tall order, even here.
You know, I think it's something that extends to the structure of our economy. You know, we've lost so many million of those good mid-level, high-paying manufacturing jobs. The job that my dad had in Newark, New Jersey, that gave us a middle-class life, bought our family a house, and put his two sons through college. Those jobs have disappeared, and our labor market has split. We have about a third of our jobs in the high-paying knowledge sector, and about two-thirds of our jobs, which are either in the service sector or part-time employment or people being out of work.
Is that
so we
really,
have an unbalanced society.
That's what the split is, really.
And what I've been trying to argue to city leaders is we have to bring up those service jobs. We've gotten. I did a workshop in New York last week with Scott Stringer, the comptroller, on how do we improve those service jobs? How do we make those low-skill, low-paid jobs better jobs? How do we recognize the employers? And in the Twin Cities, that might be a Target, for example, who are creating an on-ramp of opportunity by creating internal career ladders, by paying. Also, we have to boost the minimum wage. I've written a lot on how vibrant cities like the Twin Cities need to follow the lead of Seattle. They need to boost that minimum wage to a $15 an hour clip so that people can live a better lifestyle. But the last point you make is very important. Immigration has played a big and powerful positive role in this. And even my colleagues who were down on urbanism, who were terrified by concentrated poverty, the thing that makes them more optimistic is waves of immigrants coming into neighborhoods in the Twin Cities, neighborhoods in New York City, neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and literally transforming them with their ambition and enterprise and hard work and securing the street. So I do think this emphasis on diversity is a good one, but diversity alone won't solve the problem. It will help the problem. It will help make the problem better. We've got to make sure that we upgrade those low-wage service jobs, and I really do believe this has to be the next frontier of urbanism, making sure that those low-paid service jobs become the kind of middle-class jobs that folks like my blue-collar father had in his factory.
Richard Florida is with us in conversation today about geographic inequality, mixing in some of the data that he analyzes with his perspective as the author of The Rise of the Creative Class and some of the other thinking that he does about this. Today we're talking about how it is that a place like Minneapolis and St. Paul ends up least income segregated metros in the country, I should say among the least. What's going on in other cities like Milwaukee, like San Antonio, like some of the other cities where, and Orlando, at the who are also experiencing income segregation. And as you think about this, I want to know what you think the implications are of a more income segregated America We hear about the 1%. We hear about the 99%. If the trend continues, these groups are going to be living in even further segregated areas. What does that mean? 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828. We're online on the Daily Circuit page. Reach me on Twitter, @CarrieMPR. I think this is a kind of an interesting question here, Richard. Christy asks on Twitter, how does urban landscape influence geographic segregation? And then she asks, do urban lakes play a role in our positive integration numbers?
Well, a couple of things, and it's a tough question. I think it's the landscape of race, back to the previous caller. I think that income segregation does follow, to some degree, the landscape of racial segregation and concentrated poverty. I think one thing we've seen in America is that these areas of concentrated poverty, whether they be in the urban core or in the suburbs, are kind of immune, resistant to upgrading, and they need to be continuously put on the agenda of our local politicians and, federal politicians, and we continue to need a national urban strategy, which we don't have. With regard to the topography, it seems to me, looking at some other research we've done at the Martin Prosperity Institute, which we're also releasing in the fall, which I'll keep you abreast of, that natural amenity features like waterfronts, like lakefronts, ocean fronts, baysides, also beautiful mountainous hillsides, in general become colonized by the wealthy. Now, I'm not saying that's always the case. And here again, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities may be the positive outlier, but in general, when you look at a Miami, Florida, when you look at a Los Angeles, California, or a Santa Barbara, you find the affluent clustering around water, like bees in a hive to honey. And the other thing that the affluent really cluster around is urban centers of activity and opportunity, transit hubs, and also knowledge institutions like universities. Those are the things that seem to kind of create greater segregation. And then on to the broader point that you mentioned, I've actually come to believe that inequality is a terribly pressing problem in America, but economic segregation is a worse problem. And income inequality is bad because it suggests a separation, a distance between the top and the bottom. Segregation is worse. Think of it this way. If the wealthy and the affluent are locating around the knowledge hubs, around the urban centers of activity, and the suburban commuting cores, if they're locating around the knowledge-based institutions, and the lower-income people are pushed out to the periphery, and we see this, we've mapped this, we see this in all the maps we've made of every metropolitan area, they have not only less access to jobs, they have a longer commute. They may be commuting an hour or 90 minutes. They're shut out of knowledge and professional networks. And a great study by Harvard and University of California at Berkeley researchers shows that not only are segregation and inequality correlated, which they are, segregation has a much more substantial impact on your ability to achieve upward economic mobility. That is, to rise from a lower income or working income family as a child to a higher income background as an adult. So it seems to me that while we're talking about inequality in America, segregation is even a more troubling and troublesome problem than that.
To the phones to Ruth in South Minneapolis. Hey, Ruth, thanks for waiting.
Hi,
question.
Thank you.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess my main overlaying comment is that humans go where they think that they're going to be able to survive and provide for themselves, and that's kind of the human history. The topic of economic segregation, of course we segregate or self-segregate because we go where we can afford to go. When I was searching for a place to live, bought my first house 3 years ago, I of course could not go anywhere like Wayzata or Edina. So I'm glad we talk about this inequality, but the overarching idea is we have or we don't have the political will to even things out a bit.
But Ruth, when you were looking for a house,
yes.
Were you saying, I want to be in a neighborhood where the people have incomes that are more like mine, and I want to make sure that these are people that I kind of recognize as similar to me. Was that one of the qualifications?
Absolutely not. I live
I
in a
thought
very
you'd say
diverse
that.
community in South Minneapolis, and I'm very, very happy that it would all boil down to what could we afford. And we're very, very limited in where we can go.
Richard, what do you make of that?
Well, I think you've captured it, Ruth. When I was a boy, my parents lived in Newark. In Newark, we lived in a Italian working-class neighborhood, but was not so terribly economically segregated. There were upper-income people. There were lower-income people. My parents went to school with white, black, Hispanic people in the public schools in Newark. When I was a young boy, my parents suburbanized. They moved to North Arlington, New Jersey, a working-class suburb of Newark. My father worked in a factory. He had a seventh-grade education. He lived next door to my uncle, his brother-in-law, my Uncle Walter, who was a high executive at Colgate-Palmolive. Okay? He was the equivalent of an Uber, executive. My dad was a factory worker. They were next-door neighbors. Our town was economically integrated to some degree. No, we weren't the most upscale suburb in New Jersey, but and writers like William Julius Wilson have written about how the movement out of upper-income people, and including upper-income black people, have disadvantaged neighborhoods. So what's happened, in the words of my good friend Bill Bishop, Americans have undergone a big sort. As Ruth said, we have sorted ourselves by economic capacity, and driving that is where we can afford to buy a home. I guess everyone wants to live in the nicest home they can afford, so that housing market, as housing has become more expensive and housing close to transit has become even more expensive or close to the core, we see this sorting and segregation on steroids so that like is living near like. And I just want to go back to the point I made before for Ruth. It is the wealthy, those over 100,000 or those over 200,000 that are driving this process. Those are the ones coming in and swooping up the best housing on the best transit, near the best lakes, near the best waterfronts, near the highest performing knowledge institutions, and kind of pushing up the housing prices and driving everyone out. The end result is what I call this pockmarked or fractured metropolitan area where you no longer have a low-income city juxtaposed to a high-income suburb. You have areas of concentrated advantage juxtaposed to areas of concentrated poverty and disadvantage in the city, across the city, out in the suburbs, going into the exurbs, and you have kind of wealth and poverty juxtaposed in this checkerboard fashion with economic group by economic group, increasingly segmented from one another.
Someone who tweets as Engine for Good says, would love to hear the thoughts on baby boom urbanizing as kids go to college. Condo market is booming in low-income parts of Uptown, for instance, he says. Yeah, and Richard, I think you and I have talked about the effect of having more people move back into the core cities.
Well, I think it's true that the baby boom is beginning to shed their oversized housing. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One, they realize they don't need the space anymore and they want to downsize. Two, and I think many of them want to be closer to their kids and want to help their kids get a start. And most of their kids are in the urban center. The effect of that, of course, though, is to push those rents and condo prices up because the baby boom has had a lot of good earning years. Yes, they've suffered through a recession, but they also have that built-up equity in their home. And if they're in a community like the Twin Cities, in a nice area of Minneapolis, if they're in an area outside San Francisco, Toronto would be where I live, their housing values have increased. So they have a cash kitty to buy a nice condo and downsize. I think that puts even more pressure on the youngsters.
Right.
If you're a youngster starting out and you want to buy a condo in an urban neighborhood with good job opportunities close to where you work, that's bikeable, walkable, or you can use transit, it's harder because you're competing against baby boomers with a lifetime of income earning power and an equity stashed in a home. So I think that's a line of division. I think there is a generational line of division that's happening in our urban centers.
And a call here from Jeff in Waconia. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Richard. So actually, I'm going to challenge all your things. I don't have enough time. I'm actually from Newburgh, New York, which actually, has a really bad crime rate. I work my way from the inner cities up into a really prominent job. And what I would say is I think that the breakdown right now is between families, it's between our cultures as far as society goes, and, education as part of that, and also I'd hold the businesses responsible. I came from an area where IBM was king back in the days, and they actually moved their operations down to North Carolina. It impacted a lot of people, but people were able to get out of there and get other jobs outside of that. So I think a lot of the onus is actually on families and actually the people themselves to, go out and try and, get themselves into, a better neighborhood or things like that. Maybe not the neighborhood per se, but work with family, work with communities. Communities should be doing a job of trying to get businesses and things into the communities to draw jobs. High-tech jobs are one of those areas where we outsource a lot of. Why can't we actually train our U.S. folks to do this versus going to India and other countries? That's my question.
It's a long question and a lot of good observations. A couple things. One, it's very true. Our companies are outsourcing, and as much as they talk about insourcing, the insourcing jobs they're bringing back are low-wage jobs. They're not bringing back the $30 an hour jobs, $30 an hour jobs. They're bringing back the 9 and 10 and maybe 11-hour jobs. And more jobs in manufacturing continue to go out than in. That's really, we can harp about that, but the real solution is we have 65 million low-wage service jobs. Those are the jobs that we're going to have to upgrade. We have anywhere from half to two-thirds of our people doing those jobs, and we can't condemn them to a life of poverty. We need to realize that we made manufacturing jobs good jobs. My father told me this story all the time when I was a boy. He started his job in 1934 in the heart of the Great Depression. It took 9 family members to make a family wage. He came back from World War II from his service, storming the beach at Normandy, and he had a great job. Unions, collective bargaining, the Wagner Act, FDR. A society, we decided we would pay more for manufacturing goods so we could pay manufacturing workers more so we should have a middle class. We have to do the same thing for those service jobs. The second thing is the point about family. It's kind of a mantra among some people in America and among conservatives that if only we had stronger families, we'd have a stronger country. The fact of the matter is that we have more than 50% of adults in America are living solo. Eric Kleinenberg, my colleague at NYU, wrote a book about this called Going Solo, or Solo Nation. And we only have about a quarter of our people right now in intact family units with 2 parents in the home and children. So strengthening families is a great thing, but we have to realize that more and more of our population is living alone, and our family structures have weakened. And we're going to have to create pathways of opportunity. And sometimes people make the comment, not that this caller did, that the strong family among certain groups is the key to success versus the weak family among other groups is the reason they're poor. Well, there are a lot of highly successful and affluent single people, like Rupert Murdoch, like him or not, recently divorced. You could go down the list of CEOs.
I don't know that he's the rule here, is he?
But I think the point is that you can have a lot of success as a single person and a lot of non-success as a single person. You can have a lot of success as a family and a lot of non-success as a family. I don't think the character of the family is the determinant of success. I think it's really the avenues of economic opportunity and the geographic structure of our cities and metropolitan areas that do it. I think that we put a little bit too much explanatory power on the family.
Richard Florida is director of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic, and he's the author of The Rise of the Creative Class, among other books. And when's that new report coming out, Richard? That sounds like it's going to have a lot of interesting stuff for us to dig into.
Well, 3 things. I'm working on a new book that's probably 2 years away, dealing with kind of the looming crisis of our resurgent cities. So I have 2 reports coming out this fall. One is on this pattern of economic inequality and class division. That'll be out in September.
Okay.
And this report on economic segregation, which the blog posts were early teasers of, which will come out in November or December.
All right. I'm looking forward to talking then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stuff off the Daily Circuit page.
Mark says income segregation is a silent killer that is splitting this country in half. No better example than the San Francisco area.